So Cassandra's a Greek mythical god person who she was gifted with the ability to see the future, to see what was coming, but nobody would listen to her. She was sort of cursed with this ability to see, but have the inability for anybody to recognize it. There's this fundamental crisis of faith that's rupturing the fundamental values and norms that are really the pillars that hold up democracy. And sort of seeing these ruptures and seeing these cracks, I feel like often we're sort of running around like saying the sky is falling, and people are like, oh no, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. I think there's this sense of American exceptionalism that is so pervades our ability to kind of think objectively and honestly about the health of American democracy.
Hello, everyone, and thanks again for checking out this page. I'm honored to have as my guest today Michael Premo, who is the director of the highly acclaimed documentary film Homegrown. It was recently recognized with a prestigious DuPont Columbia Award. Michael, thanks. It's a great film, and congratulations on the DuPont.
Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate it.
In the introduction at the DuPont ceremony, Scott Pelley said the following about Homegrown. Quote, it is a raw, immersive portrait of an American movement willing to use violence to get the America it wants. For those who don't know, we're talking about which movement?
We're talking about the conservative movement broadly, but specifically a subset of that self-identifies as the patriot movement, most commonly referred to as MAGA.
And specifically, these characters would be Proud Boys.
That's correct. Yeah, the people in this film are members of the Proud Boys.
How did you end up essentially embedding yourself with Proud Boys?
So we started this film in 2018, and we just observed the sort of the level of vitriol sort of just dialing up. And as it continued to ratchet up, we were like, we wanted to better understand what is motivating people to get off their computers, out from behind their screens and keyboards and into the streets to express themselves. And so we started traveling the country, going to rallies and meetups and gatherings and flag drops, and talking to people, trying to understand who they were, where they were coming from. And as a result, we ended up following about 12 people over the course of filming this film from about 2018 to 2021. And it wasn't really until we got into the edit that we had to make hard choices around who would be in the film. But we approached people with this question of just honestly and earnestly wanting to understand what was motivating them, what was riling them up, and what would attract them to join a quote unquote movement or particular organizations.
And you focus in particular on three characters, as I recall, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Can you just give me a thumbnail of each of the three characters?
Yeah, and so as I was saying, when we got into the edit, we had to sort of make hard choices around who would be in the film because we talked to so many interesting, provocative individuals. And so when we were editing the film, we wanted to have individuals who we felt were broadly representative of the type of people that we had encountered over the last several years of doing this work, that we thought spoke to this sort of deeper kind of veins of discontent, so to speak. So one of those individuals is a gentleman named Chris Quaglin, who's from New Jersey. Chris is somebody who was not self-identified as not being political or interested in national politics in any significant way until Trump burst onto the scene and sort of spoke to him in a way that really excited him. And so he represented that sort of constituency of voters as well as individuals across the country who self-identify as never really being sort of involved in politics until Trump and that sort of world that he's animated. The other individual in the film is Thad. Thad is a Latino gentleman from South Texas, and he is sort of broadly representative of this increasing multicultural participation within the conservative movement that we discovered while through the course of our reporting. And it's something that at the time wasn't really talked about or sort of noticed in national media. It wasn't until after the last presidential election that exit polls had indicated this sort of growing voter participation of Black and Latino folks for Republicans. And so the third person is Randy. Randy represents the sort of like tireless behind the scene organizer, the sort of engine of every social movement, who's working the phones and the text messages and the emails to sort of organize people and get people out and bring people together. And he had organized a new Proud Boy chapter in New York City as part of his commitment to the cause.
And of those 3 characters, the one that I was most affected by was Chris, because Chris really strikes me in sort of a sad figure. Is that the sense you got from spending time with Chris?
Yeah, there's certainly a certain tragedy in him. He is somebody who wants to matter, who wants to do things that are important to other people. And in his own estimation, had tried to join the military, but his celiac's autoimmune disease kept him out of the service. He's someone who's tried his whole life to do things, and this was his opportunity in his eyes to do something that quote unquote mattered.
Yeah, and he does it even though he's got a child on the way.
Yeah, yeah, he's got a wife who's an advanced stage of pregnancy, who is imploring him, begging him to stay home. She's a nurse. She's worked in a hospital during the height of COVID, so she's intimately aware of the dangers that this virus can cause, and she's imploring him to stay home and mask up and just keep her and their baby safe.
And you follow them to January 6th to the US Capitol. And as Chris is preparing for that, there's this really poignant scene. And Chris says, "We've been preparing for civil war for 10 years, as I recall." What did you think you were heading into as you headed to Washington for January 6th?
So, having been sort of deeply, quote unquote, embedded with these individuals for the last, particularly for the last 4 or 5 months since the fall, we could see the tension and exasperation and frustration just building like a steam pot with the lid on. And it was really in December, after the last legal cases were struck down or not even heard by the Supreme Court, that we just saw the sort of lid just sort of blow off and people just sort of like grasping for some direction. And it was really Trump's sort of now infamous "will be wild" tweet that he sent out around Christmas time, saying that, January 6th is the last opportunity. It's the certification of the election. It's the last opportunity to stop the steal, quote unquote. And what we try to show in the film, that this was not something that was planned in secret or in private, although there was certain private individuals sort of like figuring out their planning for that day. By and large, this was something that was like broadcast across right wing and conservative news and websites, that January 6th was the day that they were going to storm the Capitol and save democracy, quote unquote, despite all the evidence that suggested that the election had been fair and that all these sort of allegations of fraud were completely unfounded. And so we saw this, we saw this energy, and we assumed that the day of January 6th, that the Capitol Police and the DC Police and the various security agencies in DC would have the Capitol completely surrounded to not allow any sort of protest crowd anywhere near the Capitol, as we've seen in other sort of instances in Washington, D.C. And we were totally surprised that morning when we discovered that there was not that level of security that seemed to match the volume of the sort of vitriol that was coming from conservative media.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was in my early days of trying to understand these extremist movements, and I remember looking at Parler. And all over Parler were, hashtag storm the Capitol. They were openly talking about storming the Capitol. And so it seemed to take mainstream media by surprise, but if you were really watching these groups, you would not have been surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. I describe it as being shocked, but not surprised. And we were, knew that this was going to happen, but absolutely nothing could prevent just the shock of the sheer scale of people advancing towards the Capitol. And we were there with that sort of vanguard, the sort of front line of the people walking towards the Capitol. And this was happening before Trump was even sort of starting to talk. and give his
One
speech.
of the s one of the scenes from January 6th that has always stuck with me, and I've shared this on my social media several times, is that scene in the lower West Terrace tunnel where you just have this crush of human beings. You have the protesters trying to force their way in. You have officers making a last stand to try to keep the mob from rushing the Capitol. And if I'm not mistaken, looking at the video, I think you followed Chris into that tunnel. It looked like you were probably just tucked into a back corner filming this all. Am I correct?
That's absolutely right. We were in that tunnel at the height of the melee.
What was that like? I cannot imagine.
So before we even got to that tunnel, we had experienced several hours of just this hand to hand combat, this pushing and shoving, fighting. Rioters were stealing riot shields and using whatever sort of improvised weapons they could have to fight against the police. And so by the time we got to the tunnel, it was such a crush of everything that we had experienced before, but just in this closed environment. And it was the wildest thing that I've ever experienced. I think the everyone was sort of packed sort of tightly like sardines, and there was people sort of yelling to sort of use the sort of collective momentum of the crowd to sort of heave ho back and forth, back and forth. And actually, in that moment, we were exactly sort of back in the corner of the archway in that tunnel filming, and we got trapped against the wall. We had our flak jackets on, our body armor, and body armor compresses your whole body. And between the gas mask and the body armor compressing our bodies, I couldn't breathe for what, was probably just a few seconds, but felt like an eternity. And I was sort of pinned against the wall until somebody I had recognized who had been a source earlier on in our reporting sort of recognized that we were in distress and sort of helped us wedge out from the wall. But it was scary.
Did you at any point ever think, what in the hell have I done?
Yeah, the thought crossed as I was grasping for breath. I was like, what is happening right now?
After that was over, I'm curious, did where did Chris go? I mean, I think we see it some scenes, but in those minutes after that crush in the tunnel was over, what happened with Chris?
So that tunnel was somewhat significant too, because it sort of led to this sort of hallway that led to an entrance that was the stairs down to where many members of Congress were sheltering in place. And so the law enforcement had just concentrated so many resources in that tunnel to try to do whatever they could to keep people out. And so as they just sort of deployed a exorbitant amount of human resources and ordinances, they finally sort of just cleared that tunnel. And Chris, after that, he had been pepper sprayed directly in the eye 2 or 3 times at least by that point, and had inhaled 4 hours of tear gas, and he just kind of went back to his hotel to take a shower and get his steaks ready for the after party.
Yeah, and the thing that struck me is he wanted so badly to be the big man, and then when it's over, it's like, "Well, I really didn't do that much," so it was what do you think was motivating that reaction?
Well, it was fascinating. It was like a really fascinating, and it's one of the parts of the film that I'm most proud of in some ways, because it's such an encapsulation of the raw emotion of the day, of how sort of excited people were, but also how disappointed they were in the immediate hours after, because the public expectation, the rumors were that Trump was going to deliver his speech, and when he was done, walk down into the Capitol and be ushered back into the presidency. And when he physically did not do that, there was dejection and frustration, and folks were trying to process. And I feel like it was one of the most honest moments that I've seen of Chris, where he was just like, okay, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. Man, it's like the cleared eyed assessment of that adrenaline come down, where you're kind of just like processing what happened in real time. And that was fascinating to see, because I think it's a real window into his true personality that sometimes he masks behind this sort of like, I'm a big important guy kind of facade, where he's just like this honest or this earnest and sort of like attentive individual who like pays attention to the details. That was kind of interesting. Yeah, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, Here's my takeaway, and you tell me if I'm on point or missing the point. These characters struck me as men who have been left behind. I almost came away, especially listening to Randy, I came away thinking this is a symptom of the inequality, the income inequality we're seeing in our country. The experts warned us that, the more extreme inequality became, the more risk there was of unrest. Am I reading too much into that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that we discovered through the course of making this film that people aren't necessarily driven by ideology, but they're looking for community, they're looking for belonging, they're looking for meaning, they're trying to like make sense of a fractured world and this sort of like growing income and economic inequality where people across the political spectrum clearly see that so much of their political landscape and corporate America is so captured by the billionaires and corporation at the expense of working people, and they don't know how to make sense of it. And it's counter to the sort of idea that anybody can make it in America. And these individuals are kind of acute, perhaps exaggerated examples of the sort of emotional turmoil that ensues from this economic disparity.
You referred at the DuPont ceremony to you and your team, maybe others, as the Cassandra Club. What's the meaning of that?
So Cassandra's a Greek mythical god person who she was gifted with the ability to see the future, to see what was coming, but nobody would listen to her. And she was sort of like just kind of pulling her hair out because no one would listen to her. And she was sort of cursed with this ability to see, but have the inability for anybody to recognize it. So she couldn't do anything with this incredible ability. And when I joke with colleagues who do this work, particularly following, understanding conservatism, understanding political violence, and looking deeply at democracy, to read the tea leaves, quote unquote, to like understand the trajectory of history and how the ebb and flow of democracies, who are looking at this moment and understanding that people are losing faith in democracy. And there's this fundamental crisis of faith that's rupturing the fundamental values and norms that are really the pillars that hold up democracy. And sort of seeing these ruptures and seeing these cracks, I feel like often we're sort of running around like saying the sky is falling, and people are like, oh no, it's not that bad, it's not that bad. I think there's this sense of American exceptionalism that is so pervades our ability to kind of think objectively and honestly about the health of American democracy. And we really are in a state that we have to think deeply around the future of what we want this country to be.
Looking ahead, Chris has a comment. He says, I think all hell is going to break loose sooner or later. If you think DC was bad, just wait. What is that a warning about, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Chris is seeing this rupture. Chris is seeing the emergence of what, if we were reporting on a country in the Middle East or South America, we might refer to it as sectarian violence, sectarian rifts. And that's really what we're experiencing in the United States. I think that comment that you mentioned, along with another comment that he says, where he is like, people think that there's going to be this big civil war, but that's not what it's going to be like. And then he pauses and he's like, it's going to be like Ireland. That's what it's going to be like. And he's referring to the Northern Ireland and the Troubles and this sort of long stewing sectarian violence where it was individuals who were fighting a larger cause, but also, there was individuals settling scores with each other and petty beefs, and just like there was this society was so ruptured to such a degree that it was hard to imagine ever coming back from that. And we're at that point, that brink, like sort of staring down into the abyss where we have one political party, the Republican Party, which no longer sees the other party, the Democrats, as a co-equal partner in governance. And for an American system which is built on this idea of cooperation among these parties, and the original founders of this country didn't even envision parties per se. They were like, different factions have to come together. They wanted to sort of do away with the parliamentary system, which was built on factions. And now we've come to a point where society is so fractured that these sort of core electoral parties no longer see each other as partners in governance. We've reached a precipice, in my opinion.
What has been the reaction to the film? Have you been able to get into theaters?
So we premiered at the Venice Film Festival to a lot of fanfare. The film has been incredibly well received across Europe, where Europeans are just struggling to understand the average Americans that they kind of see amplified through the sort of national discourse. And in the United States, we have had also an incredible response. We had a theatrical period of time in New York City, and we're hoping to go out to theaters across the country as well, and the response has been amazing. Like multiple people have come up to us after the screening and being like, "Wow, this is a film I didn't know I needed to see until I saw it." We've had responses from individuals who feel isolated. There's this group of women. This one woman in Pensacola, Florida, saw the film, and she was like, I'm like struggling to raise boys in this kind of sea of clickbait rage, and I'm struggling. And after seeing your film, I feel like I have sort of renewed ideas on how to talk to my neighbors who have gone in paths that are wildly divergent from my own thinking. But I feel like now I can sort of re-engage them, understanding where they're coming from. And that's really why we made the film.
So if people cannot find it in a theater, where can they watch it?
People can stream the film, they can rent the film and watch it at home at homegrown.film.
Well, it's a fabulous piece of work. Years went into it, and it shows. So thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Phil, it's a pleasure. It's an honor. I'm a great admirer of the work that you've done over the years. So it's an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you very much.